A couple behind bars facing charges for murder. They're accused of killing a tenant who was subletting their apartment in Brandon. They had a first appearance in court in Hillsborough County this afternoon. Fox 13's Kylie Jones joining us outside the courthouse with the details on this case. Kylie.
Once it hits you that every moment in life is a choice, you start pausing before you act. Not out of fear, but out of awareness. There's power in being mindful, something many miss until it's too late. That insight, that clarity, came from Travon Jackson himself. He recorded these words, speaking like a man who had figured out the truths of life most people spend decades chasing, and few ever truly understand. In being careful, being present, he believed the choices you make have consequences, good ones or bad ones. He was right about all of it, and yet the choice that ended his life was never his to make. March 10, 2026, Brandon, Florida. The knock on the door wasn't polite. It wasn't patient either. It came hard, repeated, like whoever stood outside had already made up their mind about how this was going to end. Inside the apartment, Travon Jackson didn't rush to answer. He already knew who it was. The same couple who had been pressing him for days. The same voices that had been getting louder, more demanding. When the door finally opened, they didn't step in like guests. They pushed their way inside. Words were exchanged immediately, sharp, heated, overlapping. This wasn't a conversation. It was a confrontation that had been building for a while, and now it was happening all at once. Before we go further, take a second to subscribe to True Crime Stories Chronicles, and let me know in the comments, where are you watching from right now? Because stories like this don't happen far away. Sometimes they're closer than we think. Now, back to how this all started. Travon Jackson wasn't someone people outside his circle would recognize. He was a man living a quiet, ordinary life, one that, like many others, revolved around getting by, keeping a roof over his head, and trying to stay steady in a world that doesn't always make that easy. At the time of his death, Travon was living in an apartment in Brandon, Florida. But it wasn't a straightforward living arrangement. He wasn't the official tenant on the lease. Instead, he was subletting the space through a couple who had control over the apartment. Situations like that are more common than people realize. Informal agreements, temporary fixes, ways to hold things together when options are limited. For Travon, this wasn't just a place to stay, it was stability. A space where he could exist on his own terms, even if the arrangement wasn't perfect. There's no indication that he saw himself as someone doing anything wrong. From his perspective, he had a place, an agreement, spoken or implied, and a right to be there, at least for the time being. But the problem with informal arrangements is that they depend heavily on trust. And once that trust begins to break down, everything else starts to shift with it. The couple he was subletting from, James Llanos and Lizana Cepeda, were the ones with legal control over the apartment. Their names were tied to the lease. That gave them authority, at least in their eyes. And over time, that authority became a point of tension. Something had changed. Whether it was disagreement over time, expectations, or simply the desire to reclaim the space, the couple no longer wanted Travon there. And instead of letting the situation play out through a formal process, frustration began to take over. From their perspective, it may have felt simple. He needed to leave. But from Travon's side, it likely wasn't that straightforward. Leaving isn't always immediate. It isn't always possible on demand. And when someone feels like they're being pushed out without warning or proper process, resistance is almost inevitable. That's where the conflict began to grow. Not in one explosive moment, but in smaller ones. Conversations that didn't go well. Requests that turned into demands. A situation that slowly became more personal, more emotional, and more difficult to control. And the longer it went unresolved, the more pressure built on both sides. The couple had control of the property, but not control of the situation. Travon had possession of the space, but not the legal backing to secure it. That imbalance created friction, and friction, when left unchecked, doesn't just disappear, it builds. By the time March 10th arrived, this wasn't just about an apartment anymore. It was about control, about standing ground, about who had the final say, and neither side seemed willing to back down. But what neither side realized was how quickly this situation was about to spiral. This wasn't a random visit. They came with intention. James Llanos and Lizana Cepeda arrived at the apartment with one clear objective in mind. Travon Jackson needed to leave that day. Not later. Not after another conversation. Not after another delay. That decision had already been made before they even got there. When they reached the door, there was no patience left in how they approached it. The knock wasn't about asking, it was about asserting presence. It carried urgency, frustration, and the kind of finality that comes when someone feels like they've run out of options. Inside, Travon was already aware of what this visit meant. This wasn't the first time the issue had come up. By now, he understood the pressure that had been building. And when he moved toward the door, he wasn't stepping into a calm conversation. He was stepping into confrontation. The moment the door opened, the tone was set. There was no easing into it. No attempt to soften the situation. The couple pushed their way in, closing the physical distance immediately. Words followed just as quickly, sharp, direct, and filled with tension that had been waiting to surface. This was no longer about discussing anything. It was about action. They wanted him out. Now. From Travon's side, the reaction wasn't compliance. He stood his ground. Whether it came from frustration, disbelief, or simply the reality that he had nowhere else to go in that moment, he made it clear he wasn't leaving like this. Not on demand. Not without process. And that resistance changed the energy in the room. Voices rose. Each sentence became more heated than the last. The space between them felt smaller, tighter, as if the walls themselves were closing in around the argument. There's a point in confrontations like this where things stop being about logic. That point had already been crossed. Now, it was personal. Movements became sharper. Words overlapped. The conversation turned into something else entirely. Something unstable, something that could shift at any second. Travon wasn't backing down. Whatever he was thinking in that moment, whether it was standing up for himself, buying time, or simply refusing to be pushed out, he held his position. And that's where the situation reached its most dangerous point. Because now, neither side was moving. The couple had already decided this was the day it would end. Travon had already decided he wasn't leaving. That kind of deadlock doesn't stay verbal for long. The tension was no longer building. It was already there, filling the room, pushing everything closer to the edge. And then, in the middle of that confrontation, something shifted. A hand moved, not toward a door, but toward something else. Something that didn't belong in a conversation like this. A firearm. For a split second, everything narrowed. The argument, the movement, the noise, it all collapsed into a single focus point. Because once a weapon is introduced, the situation changes instantly. There's no more room for error. No more space for things to calm down. Now, every second matters. Travon was still there, still standing, still in the same position he had held since the beginning. But now, the balance of the situation had shifted completely. What had been a dispute was now something far more dangerous. And in that moment, there's always a choice: to stop, to step back, to lower the intensity. But that's not what happened here. The tension didn't break, it snapped. A sudden movement, a reaction, a decision made in seconds, maybe less, and then, a gunshot. The sound cut through everything. Loud, immediate, final. For a brief moment after, there's always a kind of stillness. Not calm, but shock. Because once something like that happens, reality hits all at once. Travon Jackson had been shot inside the very place he had been standing his ground just moments before. And in that instant, the entire situation, everything that led up to it, collapsed into a single outcome. One that no one in that room could take back. And in a moment that would change everything. The consequences of that decision were only just beginning. At first glance, some might assume this was a situation that got out of hand, a heated argument that turned violent in the heat of the moment. But when investigators began looking closely at what happened inside that apartment, a different picture started to form. This wasn't a case of someone defending themselves from immediate danger. This was a confrontation that had been brought to Travon Jackson's door. The couple didn't happen to be there by accident. They made the decision to go to that apartment. They made the decision to enter. And most importantly, they made the decision to handle the situation themselves, instead of going through a legal eviction process. That detail changes everything. Because when you choose to confront someone directly, Especially in a tense situation, you are also choosing the risk that comes with it. And in this case, that risk was taken with a firearm present. That alone raises a serious question. If the goal was simply to remove Travon from the apartment, why bring a weapon into that situation at all? It suggests something beyond a simple conversation. It suggests preparation. A mindset that wasn't focused on resolving the situation calmly but on forcing an outcome. And once they stepped inside that apartment, the balance of power shifted immediately. There were two of them. One of him. They had legal control over the property. He had physical presence inside it. But instead of allowing that conflict to be handled through structure, it was brought into a confined space where emotions were already high and control was already slipping. From that point on, the situation wasn't equal. It was pressure versus resistance, authority versus defiance. Because at the center of it all is one undeniable fact. Travon Jackson was alive before they entered that apartment, and he wasn't when they left. At this point, I want to hear from you. Do you think this could have been avoided, or was this always going to end this way? The moments after the shooting were chaotic, even in their brevity. Within minutes, neighbors had called the authorities, alarmed by the confrontation and the sound of gunfire. By the time the first units from the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office arrived at the apartment complex in Brandon, Florida, the situation had already shifted. Officers were met with the aftermath of a tragedy that had unfolded in a matter of minutes. The apartment, once a home, had become the setting of a violent and irreversible act. Inside, investigators observed the space was still small and confined, the echoes of the confrontation lingering in the silence. Despite the gravity of what had occurred, the scene was approached with methodical care. Not spectacle. Every movement measured, every detail noted. Paramedics and law enforcement confirmed what neighbors feared. Travon Jackson had been shot and was deceased. There was no ambiguity about the outcome, and the focus immediately shifted to securing the apartment and ensuring the safety of everyone present. It wasn't long before investigators identified the individuals responsible. James Llanos and Lizina Cepeda, the landlord couple who had entered the apartment earlier that day, were taken into custody without further incident. Arrested at the scene, their initial statements reflected the tension and defensiveness that had characterized the entire confrontation. They were charged with first-degree murder, a designation that signaled law enforcement's understanding of the severity and premeditated nature of the act. Deputies described the incident as senseless violence, a term that captured both the shocking outcome and the unnecessary escalation that led to a man losing his life. It wasn't a moment of panic or self-defense. It was a series of decisions, choices made under pressure, culminating in an act that could never be reversed. In interviews with neighbors and those familiar with the apartment, it became clear that this conflict could have been addressed through formal channels. Legal eviction procedures, mediation, or even additional time could have prevented the fatal confrontation. Instead, what should have been a process handled on paper became a confrontation handled in person, and ultimately, with deadly consequences. The aftermath was both emotional and legal. Friends and family of Travon Jackson were left grappling with grief, confusion, and the stark reality that his life had been cut short over a dispute that didn't need to turn violent. For the community, it was a cautionary tale about the dangers of taking matters into one's own hands. All of this happened over something that should have been handled legally, a disagreement over a living arrangement that spiraled into tragedy because patience and proper procedure were abandoned. Travon's death served as a grim reminder that decisions made in the heat of the moment can have consequences far beyond what anyone anticipates. The story of Travon Jackson isn't just about a single tragic event. It's a stark reminder of how quickly everyday conflicts can escalate when emotions, authority, and control collide. At first glance, a disagreement over a living arrangement doesn't seem life-threatening. It doesn't appear as though it could lead to a fatal outcome. But in reality, danger often hides in plain sight, growing quietly until it reaches a breaking point. One of the central lessons here is that conflict, pride, and the desire to assert control can escalate faster than most people realize. What may begin as frustration or a sense of entitlement can, in the wrong circumstances, snowball into irreversible decisions. Travon's situation illustrates this perfectly. He wasn't a threat to anyone. He was asserting his right to remain in his home, yet the combination of the couple's authority, their growing impatience, and the presence of a weapon created a deadly imbalance. This case also exposes the inherent risks of informal agreements. Subletting arrangements, verbal understandings, or unclear boundaries might seem harmless, but they carry hidden tensions. When rules are undefined, when expectations aren't aligned, and when emotions take over, the situation can move from manageable to dangerous in an instant. What started as a dispute that could have been handled through legal or mediated channels instead became a direct confrontation. Finally, the presence of a weapon transformed an argument into a life-and-death scenario. Decisions made in seconds, amplified by fear or aggression, left no room for compromise. Authority alone doesn't guarantee control over the outcome, and sometimes the people we think and dictate to or remove can become the central point of conflict. The broader takeaway is clear. Some situations don't require force, they require distance. Knowing when to step back, when to involve proper authorities, or when to seek a structured solution can be the difference between life and death. Travon Jackson's story serves as a sobering illustration of this reality, reminding viewers that escalation doesn't always announce itself, and that the consequences of rash decisions can last far longer than any argument. Travon Jackson was more than a victim of circumstance. He was a man trying to maintain stability in his life. A simple goal, having a place to live, became the center of a confrontation that ended his life prematurely. Friends and family are left with grief, questions, and the haunting awareness that this could have been avoided. A life that might have continued, full of possibility, was cut short over a disagreement that should have been handled through legal channels. His story is a painful reminder of how quickly ordinary situations can spiral when patience, communication, and caution are abandoned. Travon's life, and the potential he carried, was lost in minutes. Lost because the conflict escalated beyond words, beyond reason, and into action that could not be reversed. When we remember Travon, it's not only to mourn the life that ended, it's to reflect on the choices that led there, the misunderstandings, the decisions made under pressure, and the presence of circumstances that could have been mitigated. He was a real person, with hopes, routines, and the simple desire for safety and stability. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe to True Crime Stories Chronicles. And tell me, what would you have done in that situation? Could this have been prevented, or was it destined to end this way? Your thoughts may shed light on how we recognize and respond to escalating conflicts before it's too late.